Ever get that, like, I don't know, that rush when you uncover something that's been hidden? Kind
Yeah.
of like finding a secret map and
Yeah.
suddenly, boom, it all unfolds.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to explore today. We're diving into this really interesting moment back in the early 1930s when all this stuff about Western esoteric traditions like
Hmm.
started coming out in the open. It's like, imagine this ancient wisdom suddenly becoming, accessible.
It was a major shift. Absolutely. These ideas, these practices, they were super secret for centuries, right? Only initiates were privy to them. And what we're looking at is how this knowledge, which had been so tightly guarded, kind of bursts onto the scene.
Totally. And to really understand this shift, we're going to focus on this article from 1933. It's called Ceremonial Magic Unveiled, and it was written by Dion Fortune. Now, if you're into the whole occult scene from back then, you'll know that Fortune was she was a big deal.
Hmm.
And this article, it gives us her take on some of the major players and movements of the time, especially the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and, of course, Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, Fortune's viewpoint is so crucial here because she was right there in the thick of it. She wasn't just observing from the outside, she was deeply involved in these esoteric circles. So her observations, they come from firsthand experience, which gives them a, well, kind of weight that's hard to match.
Absolutely. So what we're aiming to do in this deep dive is to really get into Fortune's analysis of why this secret knowledge, stuff that had been hidden for so long, was suddenly being revealed. We'll delve into the key figures he points to as being, instrumental in this whole process, people like Israel Regardie, Aleister Crowley, and even Fortune herself. And most importantly, we're going to unpack the significance of the knowledge they were sharing, especially the Kabbalah and its sort of intricate blueprint, the tree of life. Get ready for some serious aha moments as we, connect the dots.
Because really, understanding this period is fundamental if you want to grasp the roots of a lot of modern Western occult thought and practice.
All right, let's jump in. So Fortune kicks off her article by talking about this change in the spiritual vibes of the early 20th century. What did she see that indicated these magical secrets, ones that had been kept under wraps for ages, were starting to surface publicly?
She saw it as this kind of cyclical pattern, much like, you see ebbs and flows in other areas of human experience. And to her, the 1930s was this like a high point in a tide that had actually started earlier in the century. And the most obvious evidence, in her eyes, was the simple fact that books filled with what she considered authentic magical knowledge were being published and, becoming available to a wider audience that was interested in, well, philosophical exploration.
Gotcha. And she immediately points to Israel Regardie's books, The Garden of Pomegranates and The Tree of Life, as prime examples. For someone who's just starting to explore this area, like, what makes the Tree of Life so important? And why was a book like The Garden of Pomegranates such a big deal?
So the Tree of Life, it's like the bedrock of the Kabbalah, which, as Fortune correctly points out, is it's the core philosophical framework for all of Western occultism. Think of it as this grand map, a symbolic representation of the entire universe, and where humanity fits into it all. It's built around 10 Sephiroth, which are these spheres of energy connected by 22 paths, each one associated with specific ideas, forces, and these symbolic correspondences. And the Garden of Pomegranates, despite that kind of poetic title, focuses specifically on deciphering this complex system. Fortune even describes it as a card index system for, organizing knowledge about the cosmos and human existence according to these established symbolic links.
So like a structured system for understanding the universe and our place within it.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. So if the Kabbalah is the foundation, understanding the Tree of Life is like learning the basic language of this whole esoteric world. But what made it so tricky to grasp before Regardie came along?
Well, that's a great question. You see, Fortune points out that information about the Tree of Life was like scattered all over the place. It was in numerous texts, many of them super rare, difficult to track down, and often written in this, intentionally obscure and confusing way. So for anyone serious about studying Western esoteric philosophy or wanting to, apply those principles and practices like magic or meditation, it was a real obstacle, a huge barrier to entry, you could say.
So Regardie, in Fortune's view, really provided this much-needed key to unlock this knowledge, right? She praises the Garden of Pomegranates as this admirable handbook. She calls it clear, thorough, concise, and, affordable. It sounds like it was a real game changer in terms of making this knowledge accessible.
It definitely was. Fortune highlights several things that made Regardie's work so impactful. First, he synthesized Kabbalistic, Eastern, and Egyptian systems. So students could suddenly see the underlying unity between these traditions that were often, woven together in Western esoteric practices. She even points out how, like, theosophists who were familiar with Eastern classifications could find parallels in the structure of the Tree of Life. That was a pretty big deal, this interdisciplinary approach.
And it wasn't just about bringing different systems together, was it?
Yeah.
Fortune specifically calls out Regardie's knowledge of Hebrew as a major advantage. What difference did that make?
Oh, that's a crucial point. Fortune emphasizes that Regardie was, kind of unique among Western occultists of his time. He actually understood Hebrew, which is the original language of much of the Kabbalistic tradition. Before him, most occultists relied on translations, transliterations, often from Latin versions, which unfortunately had introduced all these inaccuracies in spelling and pronunciation. So Regardie, with his first-hand knowledge of Hebrew, was able to correct these mistakes, leading to a much more accurate understanding of those foundational texts. And this wasn't just some, linguistic nitpicking. It really affected how people interpreted the core concepts.
She even goes so far as to say that his classification of the tree and the constitution of man, like how humans are made up according to this system, is even more insightful than MacGregor Mather's introductory essay in the Kabbalah Unveiled, which is a big statement, considering Mathers was, the heart of the Golden Dawn.
It is definitely high praise from Fortune. She credits Regardie with providing these correspondences in terms of modern psychology alongside the, traditional metaphysics and psychic states. So he made the system resonate more deeply, and become more relevant for students living in the modern world.
Now, this is where things get super interesting, and it's where Fortune anticipates some controversy. She talks about Regardie revealing the attributions and correspondences of the 10 Holy Sephiroth and the 22 Paths, including what she calls the jealously guarded secret of the Tarot Trump's attribution. Why was this such a huge reveal?
These attributions, basically the specific symbolic associations you give to various concepts, energies, and archetypes with each part of the Tree of Life in the Tarot, they were considered like the ultimate secrets within certain occult orders, especially the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. To reveal these was basically making public the blueprint of their entire system. Fortune knew there would be a reaction. She predicted bitter heartburnings within these occult circles because this knowledge was considered like the key to advanced magical practice.
And she's totally upfront about where Regardie got this information. She explicitly names the Order of the Golden Dawn, founded by S.L. MacGregor Mathers, as the source. She even uses this pretty vivid analogy, comparing Rehoboam, who used whips against occult secrecy, to Jeroboam, who used scorpions to describe Regardie. What's that tell us about how she viewed this level of disclosure?
Oh, it's a powerful comparison, definitely. She's highlighting the growing openness. Fortune, who had had her own run-ins with the strictness of occult secrecy, clearly sees what Regardie's doing as a major step in spreading this, once closely guarded knowledge.
And even with all the potential backlash, Fortune gives Regardie her unqualified blessing. She argues there's no good reason to keep this knowledge secret, especially if it can genuinely help people grow spiritually, which is something she really believed in. It seems like she saw secrecy as like an obstacle.
Her argument against secrecy is really strong. She basically says that a lot of the time, the main reason for secrecy is priestcraft and prestige. It's about using exclusive knowledge to create hierarchy and, maintain authority rather than any genuine need to protect the knowledge itself.
That brings us to the whole question of occult secrecy, right? Fortune acknowledges that some secrecy within the Golden Dawn was historically justified, particularly when it came to the identities of its members, especially since some pretty prominent folks were involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. Back then, being openly associated with occult groups could seriously damage your career, your social standing, especially if you were a public figure. So keeping things hush-hush was a way to protect people.
She also talks about the psychological effects of keeping initiation rituals secret. She says it creates anticipation and helps build a group mind among those who go through the initiation. It's like creating a shared identity through these, exclusive experiences.
Exactly. Sharing knowledge that outsiders don't have access to, it can definitely strengthen the bonds between people. It creates this powerful sense of belonging, this collective identity within a group.
But then she shifts gears a bit and talks about the wisdom of keeping practical ceremonial magic formulae secret. And here her view seems a bit, more nuanced. She acknowledges the astral workings tied to these formulae and how they could be weakened if they're used carelessly by people who aren't ready.
Right. What she's saying is that these formula, they're more than just words on a page. They're connected to these unseen energies, and they can have real effects on what she called the astral plane. So if someone who's untrained, who doesn't understand these energetic connections, starts messing around with them, the power within those symbols can get, dissipated or even misdirected. But a trained occultist, someone who understands how to work with these energies consciously, can actually amplify the power of those symbols through their focused intention and, well, correct application. It's about responsible use.
So it's less about keeping things completely secret and more about making sure people are properly trained, that they understand what they're doing before they start messing with these powerful tools. And it sounds like Fortune thought the time for keeping all occult knowledge secret, at least the basic principles and theory, the time was over.
That was definitely her stance. She believed the fundamental teachings should be accessible to anyone who could genuinely benefit from them.
Now, Fortune points out that Regardie was pretty careful about how he presented those ceremonial rites in his books. He explained the basic principles, but didn't give out the complete specific formula, except for one, the banishing ritual of the lesser pentagram. And Fortune initially had some reservations about him revealing that, didn't she?
She did. Her initial worry was that, if you just give out a powerful ritual formula and people start using it without understanding it or for, silly reasons, it might lose its power. But she eventually decided that revealing this specific ritual was okay because it could protect people who were venturing into those unseen realms that Regardie's writings explored. She compared it to giving people a fire extinguisher in case they ran into, astral trouble.
Like a safety measure for people exploring these intense concepts. So it seems like Fortune ultimately thought the good that would come from sharing this knowledge would outweigh any risks of it being misused by people who didn't really get it. She even predicted that Regardie's The Tree of Life would become a classic in the world of occultism, and she wasn't wrong.
She was spot on. Her praise for Regardie's contribution is really significant. She didn't see this open sharing as a betrayal of sacred knowledge. She saw it as, and I'm quoting her here, duly accredited act on behalf of higher powers, suggesting this, divinely ordained shift towards greater transparency.
And this brings us to what she dramatically calls the unholy trinity of revealers. Along with Regardie, she names Aleister Crowley, whose big work, Magic, was being published in a more affordable edition by Foyles, which meant it was, accessible to a much wider audience.
That was a huge turning point. Even in its earlier, pricier forms, Crowley's Magic was this, massive, detailed exploration of ceremonial magic and his own, unique philosophical system. But when a cheaper edition came out, it suddenly opened up this treasure trove of information to way more people who were interested in actually practicing occultism.
And who was the third member of this revealing trinity, none other than Dion Fortune herself. Through her series of articles on the Kabbalah, published in her own magazine, The Inner Light, it's interesting that she includes herself in this group, right?
It does. It shows how much she felt like she was part of this movement, this conviction that the time was right for this knowledge to be, shared more widely.
She talks about this strong inner compulsion driving her work, this belief that, and again, I'm quoting her, higher powers willed this knowledge to be released. Like it was signaling a whole new era for occult activity. She even points to the growing public interest in ceremonial magic, even in what she called futile operations, like Harry Price's experiments on the Brocken, as evidence of this, like shared spiritual undercurrent flowing through society.
It's like all these things were happening at the same time. You've got Regardie with his systematic approach, Crowley with his, his grand magical philosophy, and Fortune with her clear explanations of the Kabbalah. To her, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a manifestation of something bigger, a spiritual impulse that was pushing for this knowledge to be revealed.
Which, of course, makes you wonder about influence. Who was drawing from whom? Fortune tackles this head on. She says the underlying system they were all working with, it wasn't something they just made up. It was and these are her words, Western esoteric tradition. Why is that distinction so important?
It's huge. It emphasizes that these people, they weren't inventing something brand new. They were tapping into this shared lineage of philosophical and magical thought, practices that had developed over centuries within Western culture. They were more like interpreters, transmitters of an existing tradition, not the creators of a whole new one.
She talks about her own initiation oaths, which have previously limited what she could openly discuss. But Regardie's, his extensive revelations kind of freed her up to speak more openly. And she anticipates that some traditional occult authorities might dismiss these books as inaccurate or incomplete. But based on her own experience, and she uses this evocative phrase, 10 years for Leah and another 10 for Rachel, to describe her years of study and practice, she believes those books are accurate, comprehensive, and well presented. What does that reference tell us about, how dedicated she was?
Oh, that biblical reference, it speaks volumes about how long she spent dedicated to studying and her personal experience. It's not just a fleeting impression. It's based on a deep, sustained engagement with the principles and practices of this tradition. So her opinion carries a lot of weight.
Let's dig into the origins of this Western esoteric tradition, especially how it showed up in the Golden Dawn. Fortune mentions Mrs. McGregor Mather's public statements about the order her husband founded, and W.B. Yeats confirming its name. So what's the generally accepted story of how the Golden Dawn began?
Well, the early days of the Golden Dawn are definitely shrouded in some mystery and, a bit of legend. The most common account is that S.L. McGregor Mathers claimed he'd found these ancient cipher manuscripts. They contained the basic outlines of the order's elaborate rituals and its core system of, well, symbolic correspondences. These manuscripts were said to be the foundation on which the Golden Dawn's teachings were built.
And these cipher manuscripts, Fortune says they were real, tangible things. She knew people who had actually seen them. And importantly, they supposedly contained the correct attribution of the tarot trumps to the paths on the Tree of Life, linking them to specific astrological signs. This connection had been this, sought-after key in esoteric circles for a long time. Why was this particular piece of information so important?
It was groundbreaking, really. The specific connection between the tarot, astrology, and the Tree of Life. It was a huge leap forward in Western esoteric thought. It provided this framework for understanding how different esoteric disciplines were connected, and it offered a practical tool for divination and, spiritual exploration. It was a unifying principle that brought all these different systems together.
And Fortune is crystal clear that Crowley, Regardie, and even herself, they all drew on these Mathers manuscripts, either directly or indirectly. She even had a chance to see some of them herself to check things out, and she found Crowley's interpretations to be, well, mostly accurate. It suggests they were all working from this common source of knowledge.
Her firsthand confirmation is really important. It helps establish a clear lineage for these teachings. It shows that even though they had their own individual approaches and interpretations, these key figures were all working with the same basic source material.
Now, here's something interesting. Crowley, in his early work, Equinox, openly said he was publishing the Golden Dawn system under the guidance of those, mysterious secret chiefs. But in his later masterpiece, Magic, he doesn't really mention his sources. Regardie, on the other hand, clearly acknowledged his debt to Mathers, Wynne Westcott, and Crowley. But Fortune concludes that Regardie probably got most of his knowledge from Crowley's AA, his own magical order. She believes it was basically the Golden Dawn system, just adapted and expanded. Her reasoning is that Mathers and Westcott hadn't publicly revealed these detailed correspondences, and Regardie wasn't directly connected to the, well, at that point, pretty fragmented Golden Dawn. What does this say about how these teachings were transmitted?
It suggests a less direct route for Regardie. In Fortune's view, the knowledge went from Mathers to Crowley, who then organized it, published it as part of his AA system, and that became a primary source for Regardie. It shows how these key individuals played a role in, interpreting and disseminating esoteric knowledge.
Of course, we can't talk about these figures without mentioning, the drama between them. Fortune briefly talks about the falling out between Crowley and Mathers, probably due to their clashing personalities. And Crowley's habit of publicly airing Mathers' secrets and criticizing him in the Equinox doesn't escape her notice. She definitely doesn't approve of that kind of behavior.
Yeah, Fortune tries to be objective about their personal conflicts, but she makes it clear that she doesn't think Crowley's public attacks on Mathers were cool. She valued a certain level of respect within the esoteric community.
But she does agree with some of Crowley's criticisms, particularly about the lack of, practical, hands-on teaching within the Golden Dawn during her time there. She describes a system that relied heavily on personal connections, informal mentoring. If you wanted to really understand things, the official teachings just gave you the basics. She even shares this rather sad anecdote about the widow of a famous artist to show how much the order had declined after World War I. What does this tell us about the internal challenges the Golden Dawn was facing?
It paints this picture of an order that had this powerful, profound system of knowledge, but it was struggling to, actually pass that knowledge on to its members effectively, having to rely on informal networks and the lack of strong leadership after the war that probably contributed to inconsistencies in how things were taught and a weakening of the order's overall structure.
Even with those internal issues, Fortune acknowledges the inherent power in the Golden Dawn ceremonies and I'm quoting her again, inestimable value of its system of symbolic correspondences. And this brings us to Crowley's compilation 777 and how Regardie used Crowley's work. Fortune explains how Crowley took all those scattered correspondences from the Golden Dawn and put them into this more structured format in 777, which she herself used for her book, The Mystical Kabbalah, in which she thinks Regardie drew on for the Garden of Pomegranates. How big of a deal was 777 in making this knowledge more accessible?
777 was a game changer, no doubt. It took all that vast, sometimes jumbled information from the Golden Dawn and made it, organized, easy to understand. It became like this essential reference tool for anyone into occultism, making it so much easier to study and use those complex correspondences.
And Fortune points out that Regardie used Crowley's writings a lot. She even quotes Regardie's reason for doing so, emphasizing how important it is to separate Crowley's insightful teachings from his, shall we say, more controversial personal life, and to judge his work on its own merits. Fortune totally agrees with this, adding that acknowledging your sources is crucial. She even predicts that Crowley will eventually be recognized as this, major English writer. It shows how intellectually honest she was.
It really does. She's able to recognize the value in Crowley's intellectual contributions, even while acknowledging that he had, some problematic aspects to his personality. And her call for an objective assessment of his work, that was pretty ahead of its time.
Finally, Fortune gets into her own, shall we say, complicated relationship with the Golden Dawn. She talks about starting out in the Scottish branch, then moving to Mrs. McGregor Mather's section, the time she was almost expelled or suspended because of her early writings, and her eventual official expulsion because supposedly her aura didn't have certain symbolic patterns. She even mentions starting her own organization, the Fraternity of the Inner Light, as an outer court aligned with Mrs. Mather's, and then she gets kicked out of that one too, for reasons that are never explained. Sounds like a pretty wild ride.
It does, right. Her experiences really highlight the internal conflicts, the sometimes so arbitrary use of power, and the strong personalities that often came with these occult orders. But even though she went through all that, she emphasizes that her connection to the spiritual heart of the Golden Dawn, it remained on a deeper level, even after she was officially rejected by its, earthly representatives.
And this leads her to think about the true nature of the temples of the mysteries. She's convinced that these aren't physical buildings you can find somewhere on a map. They're eternal in the heavens, she says. And she contrasts this with all those stories about meeting adepts in places like, the Bois de Boulogne, or tales about these mysterious masters. She sees a kind of self-deception in mistaking these subjective, visionary experiences for actual material reality. This is the core of her argument here.
She's basically challenging this tendency in some occult circles to take symbolic experiences literally and to create these elaborate external hierarchies, claiming they have actual contact with advanced spiritual beings. She's saying the real temples are states of consciousness, places you reach through inner work and vision, not physical locations or membership cards to specific human organizations.
She reaffirms her lifelong commitment to occultism. And she says that, based on her experience, she's moved away from those centralized human organizations and those claims about great white lodges or temples of the Illuminati. She even criticizes the teachings that come from people who make the loudest pronouncements, saying they're often questionable. Instead, she advocates for the validity of the eternal temple that you reach through personal visionary experience. It sounds like she valued direct spiritual experience over the authority of any organization.
Exactly. Her skepticism toward those grand, centralized occult hierarchies, it's a theme that pops up throughout her work. She seemed to believe that individual spiritual exploration and direct inner knowing were more important than following external authorities or believing in stories about hidden masters and secret societies.
In the end, Fortune circles back to what she believes is the true source, the European tradition symbolized by the rose on the cross. She suggests that Mather's got the key insights for his system from those mysterious cipher manuscripts, which she believes are connected to this deeper, mostly hidden tradition. She admits she can't offer concrete proof because she never saw manuscripts herself, but her conviction is based on her psychic experiences with the Golden Dawn and her extensive practical work in occultism. What does this tell us about, where the Golden Dawn's power really came from?
It highlights the importance of both, passed down knowledge and intuitive insight in these traditions. She acknowledges the importance of the cipher manuscripts, but she also suggests they were like a gateway to a much older, more profound stream of esoteric wisdom that's been flowing through European culture, a tradition whose true origins are still, well, pretty mysterious.
And for any aspiring occultists listening out there, Fortune offers some advice. She says if you don't have any practical experience, don't just dive into books. Find a teacher, get some guidance first. But if you've already gone through the outer court of esoteric studies, he thinks Rigardi's books are the key to moving forward. And she ends with a blessing, wishing everyone success in their search for wisdom and fulfillment. It's a pretty balanced and encouraging perspective.
It is. She recognizes that people need guidance when they're starting out, but she also gives valuable resources and encouragement to those who are ready to go deeper, to get into the practical side of the tradition.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've journeyed through this really pivotal period in the early 20th century. We've seen how this previously guarded occult knowledge started to become more open, thanks in large part to the work of people like Israel Regardie, the, shall we say, thought-provoking insights of Aleister Crowley, and the sharp analysis of Dion Fortune herself. We explored the central importance of the Kabbalistic tree of life and all the debate about those intricate correspondences being revealed, especially the ones connected to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And we touched on the complex history and the lasting impact of the Golden Dawn, along with all the fascinating people who shaped its course.
And through Fortune's perspective, we've gained a real understanding of the forces that were driving this move away from secrecy and towards, a more open sharing of knowledge within all those diverse currents of Western esoteric traditions.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to chew on. Think about this. You've got this urge to protect specialized knowledge, right? But you've also got this powerful drive to share what you know, to explore new ideas. So what are the long-term implications for any field of knowledge that's considered esoteric or, super specialized? Where do you think the balance lies between keeping things protected and spreading them around? And what are the potential benefits and, the inherent risks of each approach? It's a question worth thinking about long after our deep dive ends today.